Hi, I'm Inimai Chettiar. I'm the Legislative and Policy Director for the Justice Action Network. The Justice Action Network is the country's largest bipartisan organization dedicated to criminal justice reform, and I'm very excited about today's panel. We are going to be getting into an issue that is often overlooked in the justice system, which is the issue of criminal records and the collateral consequences that they create. So 70 million Americans have criminal records, which is 1 in 3, which is astonishing. And as we all know, the collateral consequences and stigma of that can last for a lifetime, often preventing people from getting jobs, getting housing, getting financial aid, and voting, just to name a few. That also obviously then has the effect of increasing recidivism rates, which can be counterproductive to public safety. So fortunately, there's a growing movement at the local, state, and federal level to change that. And that's what we're going to be getting into today. So on today's panel, we have a really impressive lineup of speakers with tremendous expertise to bring to the table to discuss not only the problem, but also the issue. So first we have Beth Avery, a senior staff attorney at the National Employment Law Project. Beth works to enact fair chance policies for those exiting the justice system. Next, we have Arthur Reiser, the director of the Criminal Justice and Civil Liberties at the R Street Institute. R Street is a conservative think tank working to reform the justice system through research and advocacy. Next, we have Yvonne Silva, senior director of criminal justice at Code for America. Yvonne works to implement technological changes to improve the justice system in the digital age. And finally, we have Quentin Williams, who is the campaign manager from the Heartland Alliance. Quentin leads grassroots advocacy to ease collateral consequences. Before we get into the discussion, we're actually going to show a quick video that I believe is going to be introduced as well.
I was young at the time, and I made a lot of mistakes,
Some people told me, oh, it's 30 years ago, who cares? But I cared because that was my name, that was my integrity.
Regardless of what my certifications say, regardless of what my degrees say, everything is fine until they start doing the background check. And if it's something that they see they don't like, they're not going to hire you.
Record restriction is the mirror of our times, reflecting the unresolved racism and economic inequity that still exists in our society.
They will leave today with the order to seal their record, and they will leave today with the clean GCIC to show that their record has been restricted.
I believe that this records restrictions project is geared to give people an opportunity to get jobs, to be employed, and take care of their families.
What we're hoping to do ultimately through these expungements of the records of individuals is to raise the conversation about the terrible public policy decision that we as a country have made in the last 50 years. When we should have invested in people, we invested in prisoners.
The Bible says in Hebrew, tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue. And it's a reminder to us that there is nothing as important as the pursuit of justice.
For the first time in 30 years, someone said to me, yes, we can help you.
And I can just tell you from the reaction that I've seen from the people today, I mean, we have people that were in tears because this was so important to them. And for any elected official in any community, if that's not important to you, then you're in the wrong business.
Okay, so jumping off from that, Quentin, do you want to talk a little bit about how this issue of criminal records fits into the broader problem of mass incarceration? Because a lot of people are familiar with the issue of mass incarceration, but maybe not so much what happens once you get out of prison.
Got it. Yeah, so the issue of mass incarceration, so we have millions of people who've siphoned into the criminal justice system since the late 1970s, early 80s, and a lot of those were drug cases. It was fueled by the war on drugs, so on and so forth. So, and many of those people end up coming back into the community. So the obvious way that it relates is that when you come home, right, because I was once that person, you come home and you can't get a job, you can't find affordable housing, you can't have any, and even if you do get a job, it's usually something without benefits, without, you know, you kind of just take what you can get. And that fuels mass incarceration. It fuels the cycle, because what can you do when you don't have housing, when you don't have a place to live? Everybody in this room, I don't want to assume who is in the room, but think about how central housing is and how having a place to live and a secure place to live is important. I can't tell you how many times we get people coming in saying, I can't even find a place to live, right? So when you have that, and then you have the lack of economic opportunity, and thirdly, you have the lack of upward mobility with like licensing restrictions and restrictions in our education institutions of higher ed, which are often pathways to upward mobility. So you have all of these things stacked against you. Of course it's going to fuel mass incarceration, but I think there's an even more, somewhat more subtle thing, a subtle way that collateral consequences fits into the broader issue of mass incarceration, is that the collateral consequences, I oftentimes say policies speak, right? They talk to people, right? So when you go into, say for instance, a life insurance policy, right? You're trying to get life insurance for yourself and your children, you see that infamous question, have you ever been convicted of a felony, for something like life insurance, right? So the other thing that it does that's a little bit more subtle is that it relegates you to a permanent second-class status. And it's legal, right? And it's codified in law. It relegates you to this permanent status. You have this mark on your back forever. And I've written things about, like, even when you get jobs, even when maybe you secure housing, but one of the things that never leaves, in part because of the laws that we've constructed, in part because of the barriers that folks face when they come home, it just solidifies the idea that those people are different somehow from the rest of us, right? So, and that fuels mass incarceration, because not only do you not have opportunities, but then it strips you of dignity and hope, right? So now being stripped of dignity and hope, what else is there besides a prison cell? What else is there besides the streets? What else is there besides surviving, right? You've been stripped of hope and dignity every time you go to apply for a job, every time. So I think that's like how they connect. I can say more, but.
Yeah, thank you. So Yvonne, most people don't think about technology as being something that could help ease some of these burdens. Do you want to talk a little bit about how some of the government processes are fairly inefficient and how technology can help improve that, specifically with people seeking relief from burdens like this?
Absolutely. You said it was on? Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah? All right. We'll give it a try. Code for America aims to bring a user-centered methodology to its work, to understanding how to dramatically improve government service. And one of the government service is a process around how you get relief for your conviction, whether that relief is expungement, sealing, dismissal, vacator, set aside, whatever the legal term is, but relief from that conviction that's provided. Government has set up a process to do that, and that process is bullshit, because the process is complex by design. It is costly by design. It is meant to be complicated by design because we have this question of written into policies around worthiness of that post-conviction relief. And we need to really question that as a matter of policy, because once that conviction and that relief is available under law, it actually needs to be meaningfully available. And what we've been able to see is that when you apply user-centered design, when you understand the user journey through that complicated, costly, convoluted process, the process does not make sense. And it was never designed to serve everyone who is eligible today for relief. It was never designed to scale. And so when we think about how can technology help, Code for America asked users, what would help you through this process? And one of the first user needs was, well, I need help connecting to lawyers who can help me navigate the petition-based process. But I need to connect with them on my time, not on Tuesday between 1 and 3 at a clinic that's monthly. I need to be able to connect with lawyers across convictions, across counties where I may have convictions, and at my convenience as the user. So we created an online intake form that would connect individuals to lawyers, legal aid, and public defenders in California. And we've been able to serve over 12,000 people, connecting them to lawyers who would navigate them through, help folks navigate through the petition-based process. But there aren't enough lawyers. In California, not every county has a public defender, and you'll hear me talk about this a little bit tomorrow with Christine from the San Francisco District Attorney's Office. The process isn't designed to scale. There aren't enough lawyers to help everyone who is eligible for relief. And so we need to think about how can we leverage technology to do that. And one of the things we found is, could we help someone navigate the process on their own? And then coming to the question of, like, why does this process even exist? And forging a partnership with the San Francisco District Attorney, who came out and said, this process is also bullshit, and we need to do something proactively because we are in the way as government, as law enforcement, to the meaningful access to relief. And so how can we do that? So we leverage technology by leveraging the data that government has to evaluate eligibility to provide relief automatically. Relief can be provided automatically by every state in the country for post-conviction relief. And so leveraging government data, government processes, really rethinking that process from bottom to top, from the user need outward is what's really necessary. And so we've been able to leverage technology to do that, which is a new way to think about how technology shows up in the criminal justice system. It doesn't show up in ways in service of people. And so let's actually rethink the way government is leveraging technology in service of folks impacted by the criminal justice system.
Thanks. So Arthur, Yvonne talked a little bit about what was happening in prosecutor offices. So you are someone who's formerly in law enforcement. Do you want to talk about how culture change in police departments and prosecutor offices can help with this issue?
Yeah, I mean, I always start any conversation about any type of criminal justice reform by asking a question, and that question is, are we a great nation? And if we're a great nation, then we should think about how we treat the individuals that are most vulnerable, that includes children and also individuals with a criminal history record, because of the culture we have invented of disenfranchising them. So just think about where most of these disenfranchments come from, all right? And let's be intellectually honest about where they come from. It comes from a culture of dominance and racism. Just take New York, for example. The amendment that says that individuals with criminal history records cannot vote is specifically based in decisions made to ensure that black people cannot vote in the state of New York when that amendment was passed. And so that is the history. That is the culture of this country. And I'm glad Daryl is sitting here because he said something to me about 6 months ago talking about American exceptionalism. You know, are we an exceptional people? And if we are, then why can't we do these hard things? Why can't we have a culture shift? So how do we do that when it comes to individuals that are in power, prosecutors, judges, cops, and so forth? Well, I think the first and foremost is, I'm going to steal this from, people are smarter than me, but the idea of proximity. I was a prosecutor for 9 years. I never went to a prison. Never. I was a police officer, and besides booking people, I never went to a prison. I never saw the impact of my decisions. And so I think there is this massive gap between those that are the decision makers and legislators. I mean, my God, how many legislators have actually been to a prison? And what is impacted. And when it comes to these types of disenfranchisement, of voter disenfranchisement, criminal history records, all of the above, we have this massive gap between those that are impacted and those that make the decisions. And the way that we really kind of attack this, and this is from a center-right perspective, is by ensuring that they understand the consequences of their decision. I find it very surprising that my friends on the right act all surprised that individuals don't want to participate in the system when they've been disinherited from the American dream. How can we on the right act like that's surprising? I mean, on the right, we talk about issues of due process and freedom, but only for the people that we have said get those privileges. So, I know this is kind of from the clouds, beating on a Bible, but I think that the way that we change culture is to demand excellence from those that we put in power. I mean, we are a great nation, and we need to start showing that we're a great nation by holding people accountable, by when you have bullshit laws, take people to the mat, pass better laws, demand more. I mean, Pennsylvania was a great example of clean slate, but we still didn't talk about individuals with violent felonies or any type of violent record. We need to demand more. We have to have those conversations, and we need to come together as smart people to demand that.
Thank you. So talking about changing laws, Beth, you have focused a lot on implementing fair chance policies, specifically ban the box. Do you want to talk about why those policies are so important and the impact they can have?
Sure. Well, following all these great people, the fair chance policies I work on, and I work on with NELP, National Employment Law Project, ban the box, so fair chance hiring. Get your foot in the door, have a fair chance to be considered by an employer, and pairing that also with our other big area of focus, fair chance licensing. So can you get an occupational license? Can you have access to careers? These are, I'll start off by saying we don't think this is the only reform that is necessary, but it is pairing with these other great reforms that folks are talking about, like clearing records and things like that, but you can't clear every record. So let's see if we can enact systems, enact policies that can, and processes that can encourage people with records to be viewed more fairly by employers, licensing boards, to just name a few. So, I mean, we saw up on the screen before that 70 million people have in this country have a record of some sort. It's 1 in 3 people. So these policies that we're passing have, they have the potential for broad-based impact just by sheer numbers. Certainly, they're getting passed around the country, and they vary in how strong they are, and some are weaker. So, ban the box policies, for example. 35 states now have some sort of ban the box policy. Over 150 localities do as well. But those refer to policies that the government implemented for its own hiring. Even more importantly, are private sector fair chance hiring or ban the box policies. Make sure that the private sector is accessible, because that's where so many of the jobs are. And we're at the point now where 13 states, DC, and over a dozen cities have enacted those. Now, are all those created equal? No. So even in those places, there's so much work to be done. Is just taking the question off an application really going to help someone get a job? It's a first step. It allows the fact that the person's record might not be the first thing an employer sees, and that's so important. But can we push further? Some of the stronger laws in the country delay employer inquiries until after a conditional job offer, so that you're really separating the employer's consideration of this this job applicant and their qualifications, everything they've done, rehabilitation, and everything that, that brings them as a job applicant separate from their record, and that doesn't overshadow everything they're doing. I mean, occupational licensing is another important aspect, and one we're focusing on more and more, partially because, this ban the box has really become a movement because of all of the, the directly impacted people who, coined the term ban the box and have really been pushing for these policies. It's taken on a life of its own, so, that's a win. And so we've been shifting a lot of our focus to occupational licensing barriers as well, trying to make sure, kind of like Quentin said earlier, not just, we don't want people to have access to just any job, any throwaway job. That's not the goal. That's not the American dream. We want people to have access to good jobs, jobs that can support their families, careers, just like anybody else wants. So, it's something a little over 1 in 4 of our American workers has a license or certification to do their job. I'm one of them. I'm a lawyer. And those careers often come with a moral character barrier or a review of your record, and that keeps people out of entire careers. So before they even submit a single job application, can they even take the test or prove themselves through education to hold some of the better careers in our society. It's an important step to getting people, opening pathways into the kind of the livelihood that we've been talking about here. And so obviously my work focuses on removing barriers. That's not the only important thing. We need to create pathways and address stigma and all these other things, but it's an important part of it for sure.
Thanks. So Quentin, you all achieved a really big win in Illinois last year on a law sealing criminal records, and you did that primarily through a grassroots coordinated campaign. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you all achieved that?
Sure. So we, Heartland Alliance, we are one of the founding members of a coalition called the Rocky Coalition. It's the Restoring Rights and Opportunities Coalition of Illinois, where we work with ourselves, of course, and then we have 3 other agencies: Community Renewal Society, Chicago Coalition for the Homeless, and Cabrini Green Legal Aid. So we formed what we call the Rocky Table in, I think, 2014, because we realized something that's very important and something that still exists and that I drumbeat. It's my life to make this different, and that is that communities and directly impacted people are often the objects of policy, but rarely the architects. So in 2014, we said, okay, we need to start being in these rooms and start being at the table, not just telling our sad side stories of being like, oh, I was in prison and now I'm not, now I'm good. No, we want to be at the table making decisions about things that are going to impact our lives. So the coalition table consists of policy folks, community organizers, and then what we call leaders, because that's how we address people. We address people as leaders and the leaders that they are. So the sealing bill. So we, in each one of our bills each year, I'm just giving you all a little context, but each of the bills that we've worked on since we've since we formed the coalition have to do with addressing collateral consequences. So mostly employment. We're moving towards housing now, but so each year we were doing something, and then one year we decided to expand the Illinois sealing process. So it was at first, before we introduced this bill, you can only get, I think, 9 convictions total out of all the possible convictions in Illinois. You can get only 9, which included like some very obscure things like possession of burglary tools or something like that, right? So not really getting at the population of people with records in Illinois at all. So we ended up being able to really expand it to every conviction is eligible for sealing, with the exception of just 4 offenses that we couldn't because they existed in other statutes, and we would have had to write another bill. But anyway, we're going to come for that too. But so we passed that, and one thing I'll say before I say how we did it is that when we passed that bill, and so this includes so-called violent and nonviolent offenses. So, because we don't like carve-outs, we hate them, as a matter of fact, right? Because we think everybody deserves opportunity. But we understand sometimes you have to make concessions. So, anyway, once we passed that, people were coming to us like, man, we're trying to get our records sealed, and then we had to deal with fines and fees, right? Because folks were saying, the courts were saying, you can't get your records sealed because you owe us money for XYZ thing. So we had to go back and pass a bill that eliminated that barrier as well. So I just want to, so combining both of those, the way that we did that, primarily how we did that, and we would have never been able to do it again without directly impacted people at the table. Now, not only at the table, we have a very elaborate decision-making process that makes sure that folks who are directly impacted actually have decision-making power on how we move, what strategies we make. They're not only just telling their stories, they're in those rooms. Those of you who are in policy, you know where decision-making gets made, sometimes in a room of 4 or 5 people sometimes. We were very intentional about making sure that those folks were at those meetings. And then that year, we actually had a formerly incarcerated person meet with every single member of the General Assembly. Every single member of the General Assembly was sat face to face and look eyeball to eyeball with somebody who is being impacted by these terrible laws that deny opportunity. So that was the core crucial part. The other thing I would say is that in Illinois, there's Chicago and then there's everybody else, right? So when we go sometimes to our more rural areas, right, they often think that we're coming trying to do things just for Chicago, so it's sometimes very hard to get them to get on board with this. But one of the things that we also did was to talk to them about the widespread impact of criminal records, and they have people in their constituencies with criminal records as well. And when they started hearing the stories, and when we started really acknowledging, like, this is a problem for your community too, then they also got on board. So then we were able to get bipartisan support, and we killed it. I mean, it was almost a unanimous vote. It wasn't unanimous. I got them on my hit list, those people who didn't do it. But so but that was crucial though, to make sure, because those of us who are from big cities, like, sometimes we don't come, I don't think, with the right approach to other folks, and in terms of framing how this issue also impacts them too. Because to the earlier question, collateral consequences just imprisons people beyond their sentence. So it's just an extension of the prison. And to frame that way, even for our friends in central and southern Illinois, they got that because they see their people going through that. So those are just a couple of ways how we did that.
Thanks. So Yvonne, going back to the role of technology, when a lot of advocates are passing laws like this and trying to get legislators to move through things, it's also really important that people think about implementation and how that's going to play out. And so this is also obviously a role where technology is really important as well. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. We often think through reforms, and the implementation comes during the implementation phase, which is necessarily phase 2. And what we have found is that we've left the machinery of government, how it actually works, to government to figure out. And then in my case, my background, then we sue them when they get it wrong. And so how do we think about implementation at the front end? Often to make sure that government isn't making what seem like bureaucratic decisions, but ultimately have enormous impact on actual relief being accessed. And so when we think about implementation during the policy design phase, we're talking to the agencies that are responsible for implementing this, acknowledging the politics that goes into moving reforms, and that's a dance that has to be done. But imagine, the state agency that houses criminal history data understands and is thinking about, how am I going to implement this reform? How am I going to make sure in a year the 1 million people who are eligible for this relief get it on day 1? how am I going to start thinking about that from a technical, operational process? Because we can pass great policy, but if the process just is sort of weighs it down, we have to continue to bring new reforms. We'll have to continue to sue the government to actually do what it's needing to do. So let's think about one of the things we've been talking about is, or thinking about is, one refrain we often hear too is, it's not possible. Government can't do this. We can't provide conviction relief at scale. It has to be one by one. That's the only way. And that is just not true. Government operates at a mass scale. It has to operate at this scale that's necessary for the relief to be felt. And so from a technical standpoint, technology inherently allows us to achieve scale, which when we think about in post-conviction relief, that's also around questions of equity. How do we ensure that every county in a state is providing the relief, not just the counties where there are reform DAs, right? Not just the counties where there are reform board of supervisors, not just the states that have executive and legislative branches who have prioritized this this effort as part of their agenda. And so, so when we think about technology during implementation, it allows us to test a couple things before it goes into effect. In California, as an example, what that has meant is, in partnership with 5 counties, including San Francisco District Attorney as our first county, we've been able to set the standard for how California has the capacity and the tool to ensure that within a year, every marijuana conviction is reviewed and the vast majority will be dismissed or reduced within a year. In the time that legislation, legalization, was passed in California, just 3% had petitioned the court. So government can operate at scale, and we just need to show that that's possible, think about implementation during the reform, and then also hold it to that standard that it ought to and it should.
Thanks. So, Arthur, as we're talking about enacting legislation and implementing legislation, one of the things that most people are aware of is that this movement to pass these laws has really been bipartisan, and a lot of conservatives and progressives have come to the table to be able to get these reforms through. What I think is particularly interesting is there seems to be a lot of conservative interest, particularly in these reforms, so around ban the box and reentry reforms and fair chance policies and expungement. Do you want to talk about a little bit about why you think that is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is like the stars align perfectly for conservative ideology on this issue. And I think there's 4 major points. I think the first is human dignity. Some of you might be surprised that there's a conservative up here talking about human dignity. But you know, conservatives act like we have a monopoly over morality. We don't, but we like to talk that way. And framing this as an issue of not right versus left, but right versus wrong is persuasive for conservatives. You know, I pull out the Jesus card every chance that I get. My mom was a Jew, but I still feel free to do that. And you know, and listen, Jesus Christ had the worst time in the criminal justice system. Can we just admit to that? And I find it very hard to believe that a man with his dying breath forgave the individual convicted of a crime next to him, that he would be standing here today acting like people need to be stuck with the government's foot on their throat for life. These are life sentences that we're really talking about here. So I think that's the first. I think the second is safety. We like to talk about public safety. I do like to also bring up the fact that we never talked about criminal justice as a political football until the 70s, basically. We never did. This wasn't something we did. It was always about good ideas. There was a huge racial aspect to it that we're going to talk about here today. But it wasn't until like the Barry Goldwater election where he found that he could actually strip away southern states that we started to do this. And they used the word public safety over and over and over again. Look at Richard Nixon's nomination speech. When he got the first nomination, he never said law, never said order, never said safety. And then he said it 23 times the next time he was nominated because it became something that they can latch onto. And we know that this doesn't make us safer. It makes us less safe. You basically have created a system where people are perpetually held underwater You know, and I find that to be quite remarkable that we have the data that shows this is make us safer, but we still latch on to these ideas. I think the third idea is limited government. Limited government is the bedrock of conservatism. There's a famous line in my movement that government should be big enough to be able to be drowned in a bathtub. But this is the biggest aspect of the government in most people's lives. Yes, the military is bigger, but the military doesn't affect us on a daily basis. This affects us every single day. And by definition, a government that is acting arbitrary and capricious against its people, which this is, cannot be a limited government. So that absolutely violates conservative principles. And I think the last one is fiscal responsibility, which I find boring, so I don't talk about that much. But I think that if you take those principles and you apply the idea of collateral consequences to it, it just isn't fair. Fairness is important. We always talk about fairness. But when it comes to criminal justice system, we forget that. If any other government program acted the way the criminal justice program acted, we would be talking about banishing it. We would have presidential people pounding on their podiums talking about, I want to get rid of this department, that department. But we just give it a pass when it comes to criminal justice. So if you take our principles and you look at the reforms that are on the table, clean slate, voting restitution, they line up pretty good. And that's why we're seeing this kind of, you know, sometimes it's an insurgency within I'm an insurgent within the center-right movement. But I think that it's actually playing out really well. I mean, we have a president who is him, that you know, it signed the first step. People were unhappy with it, but it's going to get 40,000 people out of prison in the long run over a certain amount of time. And so we are seeing these movements, and these principles do play out in positive ways. And I'm hopeful that, especially with this issue, we're going to see it play out even more and more intently.
Thanks. So this is going to be the last question from me, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So, Beth, do you want to talk a little more about the racial disparities and racial bias and how that plays out in the context of criminal records and collateral consequences?
Yeah, the white girl will talk about that. Oh. No, I mean, I say that seriously, but at the same time, it's important for us all to be acknowledging the race disparities and how this is a racist system. And I asked to make, I wanted this to be highlighted on the panel, and even if it means the white girl's got to, it's going to talk about it, it has to be talked about. We've talked, obviously the scene was set this morning with so many great presentations about, you know, data from Bruce Western and all those things. In terms of collateral consequences, you know, it starts with the fact that our criminal justice system, mass incarceration, has absolutely, you know, decimated communities of color and affected them at much higher rates than it has our white population. So, you know, nationwide incarceration rates for black populations are 5 times that of white people. Arrest rates more than double. You know, higher conviction rates, longer sentences, all of that. Mass incarceration, you don't need me to be throwing more statistics at you right now. And what comes out of that is this is absolutely a civil rights issue. It can't be separated from that. I work for the National Employment Law Project. A big part of that is, you know, Title VII and race discrimination and disparate impact, and that's been acknowledged over time. But yeah, we have to start by just, you know, always making sure that's front and center. And, you know, again, this white girl talking about the issue here, I know that I need to take my direction from people who are directly impacted, from people of color. You know, I think that's an important part of the process for coming up with, like, when we're working on our policy approaches and things like that. When it comes to collateral consequences in particular, you have a whole other layer on top of it, because you have not just racism built into the system of mass criminalization and incarceration, but then you have, you know, the racism that the built into our other systems. So employers, for example, studies looking at job applications that were submitted, you know, one that has, you know, the box checked saying, you know, has a record, and one that doesn't, there's a difference in the callback rates. Well, for white people, for white men, the callbacks went down by half for people with records. For people of color, particularly specifically men of color in the study, it went down by nearly 2/3. So it builds on each other. It's not only is the underlying mass incarceration system racist, but then having a record has a bigger impact on people of color. I'm focusing on men of color because that's what a lot of the studies look at, and that's the biggest formerly incarcerated population. And then from there, Bruce Western talked about this morning, but we impact generations to come. So I think CAP came out with a number that about half of kids, or at least half of kids, have at least one parent with a record. So we're talking about the next generation of kids and their access to upward mobility and all of that, and the compounding factors that come from that. So it's layer upon layer, and I think we need to address it at all different levels, which is why this conference is so great, because we're talking about so many different levels.
Yeah, thank you. So we have about 30 minutes for questions. Let's start with you and then in the front here.
So my question is, I'm an advocate in many areas, because in the area of criminal justice, my advocacy stems from one-on-one with the people in my neighborhood, all the way up to I'm a public official for the district that I live in, and I'm also just recently elected as a county committee member represented by the party. So it's my intention to push forward as much as possible to have policy changes that can impact and better the experience for people in this arena. A concern that I have is many people that I've advocated for that have attempted to turn their lives around from having an experience in the criminal justice area into doing great things. One young lady that was looking at a 3-year drug sentence was able to get out of that and within a year graduate from high school, get accepted into college, and then get transferred to Boston University. I have a nagging concern that even though she's done all those great things within a span of like 2.5 years, is her criminal background going to hold her back when she's done? And I see with people who have graduated, have excelled, when they go through job application process, interviews, etc., where even though the box is banned, that somewhere along the way they're still discriminated against, even though their conviction has no impact on the type of work that they're seeking. And the problem that exists is even though the law supports that they should not be discriminated in that, that's pretty much the end of the road when it comes to that, because do they have time to fight that organization or company for that job? They need a job. They're probably just going to continue to focus, and they probably don't want to work there anymore anyway, since that's what's happening. Already they haven't even started working. So I'm also a developer, and so my question is there anything in the works to automate some of these processes so that it eliminates the opportunity for companies to do as much discrimination as they are, where it would automatically weed out options for them as far as, okay, this person is already on this far in the track, we've already offered them the job, and their record does not exempt them from being able to have this job, and so therefore, that's it. They have the job. Is that a possibility? Because I see too many people fall into that. But.
Do you want to talk about fair chance? I can talk about the technology.
I think I don't know that there's anything particular in the works. I think that what I can start by saying is that obviously ban the box is a compromise measure. The people who coined it and came up with it, they recognize it's not a panacea, it's not a silver bullet, it's not going to solve everything. Like, do we eventually want to get to a place where you can't ask about it at all and not just delay it? Of course. In terms of automation, I'm not as familiar with that now. I should turn it over to Yvonne.
We in California, there's a fair chance law that delays the consideration of running a background check and the consideration of anything that shows up on the background check in the course of employment. You have to make a conditional offer, and then there's a period of time by which the employer can do a background check. And we had built an early prototype for an individual going through the process to, one, know their rights under the fair chance law, and two, to activate their rights under the law, which is they have a 5-day window that starts when they get declined. The conditional offer is retracted from the employer because of something that shows up on the background check. The individual has 5 days to submit a statement, personal statement, supporting statement to say, give me the background check, and here's the context for whatever has shown up in the background check. I have 5 days to send that back to the employer. I'm skimming over the parts of the law, but there's a 5-day window. And do you know the law better? No. Oh, okay. I was like, someone help me. But there's a 5-day window. So we created an early prototype that would guide folks through their rights under a fair chance, and then help prepare all of the paperwork that they could then submit to the employer. And there's a number of barriers there. Massive outreach would have to be done in order to even access this application, right? You have a bunch of technologists who are building a thing that might not actually be serving a need, because the greater need is the discrimination that's happening. The greater need is that ability to look at the background check. The greater need is why is that being used as a reason to not employ me when at all, right? And so we also explored, well, could this application start to create data for the enforcement agency at the state level that would then enforce key bad actors, because you can start to surface the same actors across the state who are retracting conditional offers. You can actually start to track that. And what we found is, yes, maybe, if it was a priority for the law enforcement agency. So there is some opportunity there, and I think we need to think more creatively about how to leverage, and Jill here in the room back there through the Public Rights Project is thinking about how city attorneys and attorney generals can leverage their consumer enforcement arms to really make that happen. But we were starting to, but it didn't gain much traction because of the barriers.
So let's go here and then, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I just want to quickly say, you raised two issues really with that question. One is implementation, and then the other is the problem with background check companies, right? So we pass policies all the time, and then we celebrate, and then I think somebody up here said we need to start thinking about implementation as we're developing the policy. So I think raising the issue that yes, ban the box is passed, but then there's still discrimination, right? And I think that's just because of a lack of focus on implementation and accountability to the laws that we actually pass. And I just want to say that, are we thinking about that? Absolutely, we are. That is a big focus of ours, because we can't keep passing laws and celebrating, and people still aren't feeling the impact of the policies that we're implementing. And then the last thing about the background check companies is the Wild Wild West. They can do whatever they want, right? In our state, we really tried to implement a bill to regulate that industry, but we preempted by federal law. The Fair Credit Reporting Act kind of gives them lots of wiggle room in certain states as to what they can do with background checks, because even if we seal, ban, they can just go through some shitty background check company and get some bad data, bad information, old information, and not to mention that information is not even good to even predict whether somebody's going to be a good employee or not anyway. So say all that to say, we are thinking about implementation. I'm certainly thinking about these background check companies and what we can do about that.
Let's go here.
This morning before lunch, there was a little bit of discussion about incremental change versus transformative change, and the possibility of incremental change working in the service of transformative change. And so this is a kind of a combination question for Yvonne and Quentin. Yvonne, when you did your project, and maybe there was more than one project, but maybe the first project with the San Francisco DA's office, were you working under existing law to expunge cases automatically without any additional legislation? Was that?
We were working under existing law, which was a voter referendum that legalized marijuana and created a pathway for post-conviction relief for marijuana convictions. It was a petition-based process that did not prohibit a local district attorney from taking affirmative position, because they were, as you'll hear Christine talk about tomorrow morning, they are an actor in the process that was challenging. And in California, 98% of marijuana petitions were stipulated to. They were unchallenged. And so now that's those who have actually petitioned the court. So the work that the pilot with San Francisco was under existing law that had the remedy available, that laid the ground. San Francisco DA also pursued legislation that was then passed that mandates that same process statewide. And so through our partnership, we helped to show how it would be done, so that there was actually a way in which it could get done within the timeline provided under the law.
So if I could just ask the second part to Quentin. One of the things that drives me nuts is that a lot of people, you alluded to this, Yvonne, in the beginning, I thought, when you said that government creates a process for expungement, but you have to know about it, you have to jump through all these hoops, you have to do all these things. But if you get there, then it's allowed to be expunged. And I feel that if it's allowed, then it should be on the government to make it happen. So I'm wondering, in Illinois, if the legislation that you guys worked on, did it automatically, created the expungement automatically, or people still have to jump through the hoops?
So it's not expungement, sealing, right? Which is something that's a little different. The expungement can't really get anything expunged in Illinois, like to completely get rid. Right, not Chet. There you go. He's right, not Chet. But no. So people still have to go through the process. However, thankfully, one of the organizations that we work with and a couple of other organizations that we partner with, we did a lot of outreach, a lot of Know Your Rights campaigns, a lot of free legal aid for folks that want to petition the court to get their records sealed. So no, it wasn't in the legislation for this to be a mandated like government process. People still have to jump through the hoops. But we do have lots of great organizations that help walk people through those loops, free of cost often. And we did do a really big push once we got it passed to get the information out to folks, and we're still doing it. We're still pushing information out, letting folks know what's available to them.
Let's go here in the front.
Yes, I have sort of a two-part question. One is, my name is Zaki, by the way, work with an organization called Next 100. I'm specifically focused on collateral consequences and looking for ways to seal or expunge records here in the state of New York. And so one of the questions is that I've never come across like what is actually the criteria of rehabilitation. Like the word is just kind of thrown out there, rehabilitation, and no one seems to have a criteria for it, no employment, no one has like this criteria of what is that to give a person an opportunity to actually exemplify and show that I fit this criteria. Is there something in the place, so when we talk about banning the box or what have you, is there anything into place in terms of like policy to say here is the criteria of what rehabilitation looks like for a person, right? And the other question is time. If I'm being judged for a case in 1992 or 93, and here we are, is there anything into play to say, hey, wait a minute, you can't even look that far? Or that's just by automatic, when we're talking about automation, let's go in and just chuck all of that, right? We're talking 92, 93, 25, 20-something years old, even in some cases 15 years old. How can we just like automatically chuck those things? And is there a conversation about anything in regards to that?
Who'd like to take that?
Automation and that criteria.
Take the first question.
And you don't have to actually have an answer.
Yeah.
I'm throwing it out there just in case. You know what I mean? So
The first question about the criteria of rehabilitation, you're absolutely right. There is none, and in fact, what happens is that that burden of proof falls on the formerly incarcerated individual, which operates as a literal burden that they carry on. I used to know, just as a quick story, like I used to know a gentleman who would literally carry around in his backpack a folder with like certificates and letters, and and he would present that every single time that he went to go do anything. So I appreciate you bringing it up, because that's what I want folks to know, because folks often think once somebody is in school, everything's okay. Once they have this menial job, everything's okay, and they're living in this apartment that they hate in the neighborhood where they feel unsafe, right? And they think it's over, but that burden, right? So I'm not talking about barriers right now. I'm talking about the burden of proof that I am not a bad person lives in the mind and the heart of a formerly incarcerated person. Every single person that I know that lives in my heart. I'm about to be a doctor, for God's sakes, but I still think about it.
That's the impact.
I still think about it. I'm still like, I wonder what they're going to think about me, right? So I don't have an answer, but I'm glad you raised that so folks in here can understand that burden rests, that burden of proof of who's a good person versus a bad. That's why I hate the good, bad, moral dichotomy. That's like at the foundation of that, right? Who's good, who's bad, those people versus us.
And I'll just address the policy perspective for a minute, because you're right. A lot of it is like, what does the law say? And I'll say that, like I said earlier, the laws are, like, even when you've passed a ban the box law or you've passed a law to reform your occupational licensing, the quality is all over the place. But some of the better ones are trying to get at this. So it's a little easier on the occupational licensing side, because you're imposing, requirements on the government as opposed to private employers, so you get less pushback. But in particular, in fair chance licensing reforms, trying to make them specific and trying to shift the burden. So some of the better ones, and what we're aiming towards, in our ideal policies, are, it's up to the licensing board to show that the person does not meet certain criteria, or that they're not fit. Shift that burden for the first part, and then, list out specific criteria, define what rehabilitation means. It's hard to get too specific, because when you're passing a law, people will be like, well, what if this? Well, what if that? And try to push back with all these crazy scenarios. But to say you need to look at X, Y, Z, you need to look at how much time has passed, you need to look at the nature of the offense, you need to look at the nature of the job and the relationship there, you need to look at education, volunteering, what the person's been doing, give them an opportunity to come forward with information. So the better laws are trying to address this. It's still a tough problem. But I think part of the shifting the burden, which has been done in not as many laws, is a really important step there. Because like you said, it's like a person walking around with a briefcase full of letters because they have to prove, oh, I'm actually a good person. No, like if you're going to be denied an opportunity that's available to everyone, I think that burden should be shifted in a lot of situations. And in terms of look-back periods, some of the better laws also say you can only look back this number of years. It's less frequent, and again, in the fair chance hiring ban the box context, because it's harder to get those things passed. But it's an important part of getting in there. Just narrow the window, like narrow the scope of the record inquiry, just as a first step, and then look at less and take a closer look at it with a more individualized assessment, case-by-case assessment. So I know these they don't guarantee a perfect outcome, but implementing processes that are designed to be more fair is an important part of affecting the outcomes. So it's part of the solution, I guess, is the best I can give you for now.
Other questions? So let's go here and then over there. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's actually not a question. Is it okay if I respond to one of the... Sure. My name is Aisha, I work for Participating Impact Justice. And this is specific to California. But in California, particularly in South over to other juveniles, but in California, they've actually, January 2018, they started what they call an honorable discharge petition. And what that is for any young person that was committed to the division of juvenile justice, if they've been out for 18 months.
Thank you. In the green?
Could you please use the microphone for the closed captioning? If you don't have the microphone, it won't go into the closed captioning system. So if someone could hand the microphone, thank you.
Hi, I'm Pauline. I'm from a Criminal Record Sealing Project in Boston. There is a body of case law on rehabilitation, like in Massachusetts, we have a case called Commonwealth versus PON. And so things like going to a substance use recovery program or looking for work or completing a work training program. So I think that can be something you can use in your work. But I had a more general comment. I've been doing record sealing expungement work for about 10 years, and it strikes me that we've had the Ban the Box campaign, but virtually every state has stupid things in its law, the BS, as you call it, of record sealing and expungement. In Massachusetts, we were so backward that if you had a resisting arrest conviction, it was a never sealable crime. It's ridiculous. But it seems like, just like there was the clean slate movement, which is a great idea to automate the processes for sealing and expungement, that we ought to have a campaign with and try to do it nationwide, because the waiting periods are always too long. The first time I worked on criminal justice reform in Massachusetts, we got the waiting periods reduced from 15 and 10 to 10 and 5, and now they're, as of last year, 3 for a misdemeanor and 7 for felony, which is still higher than the recidivism literature. So it's really, really wrong that you have these waiting periods or you have all of these ridiculous exceptions. So I was thinking in terms of NELP, maybe the campaign, you could come up with a snazzy name, but we could, I think nationwide, if we all did it together, there's power in numbers. I think we need to keep going back and getting these waiting periods reduced to something that's much shorter, or I think for some offenses there shouldn't be any waiting periods at all. At least in Massachusetts, if you're not convicted, you don't have a waiting period to seal. But just food for thought for the future.
Thank you. Okay, do you want to? Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon. This is very appropriate, and I chair the Humanities Division at the University of the District of Columbia Community College, and recently criminal justice program has been placed in humanities. And while I worked somewhat closely with the former director, I wasn't really involved because I had all of the other humanities to look at. Now I need to be more involved. We also in the District of Columbia have a program where any resident of the district can come to our workforce development and have training for certification, licensures, things of that nature. We have returning citizens in our college. And part of the concern, and I've heard it expressed here today, is you come to the program, you are successful, you get your certificates, you get the license, and then you go seek employment. Now, we have Ban the Box, where the employer cannot ask before a conditional offer is made. But once the offer is made, then they can look and ask and do all of that. So before I came here, a couple of the citizens came up and said, Doc, can you ask about, we know it's not DC, but what's going on? What can we do? So part of the concern is educating myself, not only what's going on in DC, but is there a national movement? And our returning citizens are very active. They're stakeholders, so they want to be engaged. They're doing a lot of this in DC. So what is it that stakeholders, that these returning citizens can do themselves to be more of, they're already advocating, but what else can be done to encourage and let people know we don't want you to not take advantage of this opportunity to get this skill, but we also don't want to have all of these individuals getting the skills and then unable to utilize them.
Who'd like to take that?
Real quick, sorry, before you answer that question, I wanted to note that we do have 15 more minutes, so we can do audience questions for another 15 minutes after this one. Okay.
I think this kind of goes into what I was trying to say earlier, is that everything that people have talked about here is awesome. There is a national campaign to pass clean slate in all 50 states. I'm part of that campaign. I'll talk to you offline about what's going on with that. But Everything that people talk about here is fantastic. I agree with all of it. But if we do not have a cultural change in how we think about this issue, we're really just nibbling at the edges. What are we really going to accomplish without changing the way that our fellow citizens think about individuals with criminal history records? And if people say that, well, that's too big, that's, you're talking about something too big, bullshit. We've done huge things in this country. We built a freeway system in 10 years. We have totally had a tectonic shift on the way we look at gay marriage in this country in a generation. We have changed marijuana laws throughout this country. West Virginia is going to debate legalizing marijuana next year. West Virginia, I lived that place for 3 years, all right? 3 years of my soul in West Virginia. And I'm telling you that we can do great things. But it really does, it has to be a cultural shift. We have to start talking about this as a cultural shift. We have to stop eating our own babies when we disagree with little tiny things. And we have to keep our eye on the prize, which is a systematic change in the way that our fellow citizens and our fellow Americans and people that are here visiting think about individuals with criminal history records. And I think it's possible. And I don't think it's going to take generations, because it didn't take generations to get to this place. We're talking about 40 years. We have the way that we think about criminal justice in this country systematically, fundamentally changed in 40 years, and it was because people wanted to win elections. And yes, you can blame the Republicans; we're mostly at fault. But the Democrats didn't come to the table with better ideas. They just they wanted to win elections too, and they saw, holy shit, we can win elections by screaming and yelling about the Willie Hortons of the world. There was Democrats running Willie Horton ads all across this country after it was successful. So to answer your question, I think that we're at the edge of something great, but we have to push, and we have to really, it's going to take blood, and it's going to take time, and it's going to take sacrifice. But I think everybody here is willing to do it.
Next question. In the back.
All right, so this might be a little bit different. So I'm a brand new public defender, and I've noticed we've all been talking about like removing records on the back end, which is fantastic. I'm 100% supportive of it. However, when we're in court, we'll get people who are, they'll plead guilty to crimes that maybe they didn't commit. Maybe we can litigate a motion and get them off. But the issue is, they're poor, they can't afford cash bail, they're going to face a penalty if they take the case to trial. So we're basically taking a system that's pushing people towards getting records and then trying to deal with them on the back end. Has anyone ever thought of like any way to basically keep a lot of these people out of the system in the first place?
Someone want to take that?
That's most of my work, actually. But I mean, that's the vast majority of the work that I do is trying to prevent people from getting criminal history records in the first place. The damage is done by the time we're talking about criminal history records. You're already, I don't want to say the F word because it's going to show up on there, but you're that word. And so I think that the real if you really want to have an impact on criminal justice is police diversion is a huge avenue through. I'm not talking about drug court because it's too late at that point. I'm talking about actual diversion, deflection out of the system from the first place. Think about how we talk about juvenile justice, because the vast majority of people who have juvenile justice records are going to end up having adult records. We just know that happens. We've seen it. We've seen this movie. We know how it ends. So I mean, yes. There's 6 panels all about that issue going on. I can talk to you all day about that.
And what I was going to say was that, so in Chicago in particular, Illinois more broadly, there's tons of work being done on bail, tons of work being done around sentencing reform, and then also work being done with juveniles and diversion, and we have restorative justice courts and all of that. We have all of that. The thing I would say, though, is that what we're talking about today, the collateral consequences, so we need to do all of that holistically, right? We need to keep people out, But then also, once they get out, we need to, so it's just a different facet, right? But all of those things are important. We need to address it holistically, and we're just talking about one slice of this monster today, so.
Next question. Here in the front.
There was some discussion about certain organizations working on bipartisan efforts to address these issues. My question is related to the fact that generally conservatives have been in support of policies that are not in the spirit of what we're talking about today, and that to me is part of the problem. And we're not really talking about that today, but can we talk about that? Because I think that's a huge factor, that there are constituents that have an interest in criminalizing people. There are people that are making tons of money off of criminalization, and also by our Congress people, and sway other elected officials from the federal level all the way down to the local level. So how do we change that impact in the system?
Yeah, I think I'm the token conservative up here. I'm a non-crazy conservative. This is what Ed Chung calls me. Yeah, you're right. Democrats are guilty of this too. I mean, this be honest. But we're mostly at fault, I would say. I think that's fair-ish. And I think that the solution, and this is the problem that I actually have with my progressive friends, is and this is the problem with progressives, I'm sorry, please don't throw rocks at me, but you guys are way more interested in being right than winning. And be right all you want. Be right. But if you're not gonna pass a bill, okay. You're just right with nothing passed. And it takes both sides in order to pass anything meaningful in the criminal justice. There's states that'll pass it with just blue blood, but if you really want to make something transformative across this country, you need right-left coalitions. Every successful major bill that has passed in the United States has had right-left coalitions, with the exception of a couple that's happened in California through mostly proposition efforts. Yeah, you're right. We have really shit the bed on this, and I really hope there's a consortium of conservatives. There's a lot of conservatives that really care about that history and are hiding from that history and are trying to do a better job. That's the best I can say on that.
Yeah, and I mean, in terms of bipartisan efforts, we recognize that like where there's overlap, let's get done what we can. I think both sides are wary of like, all right, where are you really trying to go with this? I mean, we were talking this morning, the big panel about incrementalism versus, someone help me with the word, transformational change. And so, I mean, I know that like, you're always worried about that when you're doing policy work, and when you're working with people across the aisle, you're especially concerned, like, all right, let me take a look at this incremental, this isn't actually gonna work against us in the long run, is it? And so, yeah, there's hesitancy, but at the same time, like, you wanna get done what you can, and so, it's a balance.
So I think we have time for 2 or 3 more questions. If there's, oh, sure, go ahead, Quentin.
Just quickly. And I think we should, because I like bipartisanship when it works, right? But like, I just think in general, I would love for us to like really change the context, because right now, the context is us versus them, right? And we really need to change that context, because what I found in Illinois, I'm telling you, in Chicago and everybody else, they're like, they don't, they kind of got this. But that was a narrative that I had about folks like Arthur, right? Like, be like, I know what he thinks already. But like, people are way more than the stories you make up about them. And what I found was, I actually sat across the table from some of these folks, and we get down to the human level. Beth just mentioned that there's overlap when we get done what we could get done. I think if we just had more honest, authentic, genuine conversations with folks who don't agree with us, which is a problem for us, because we live in the context of disagreement, and that's cool now, because I want to be right. But if we get to a point and change that context and say, hey, wait, we have this human problem that's going on. We're both human, let's start there. And then to have a genuine, authentic conversation, I have found that to work, right? I've gone in Republicans' offices who, on a range of issues, they're like, I would never agree with them on anything. But once we get past the agreement and being right, I found that oftentimes we develop a relationship that goes beyond that. So I think that's what we should start considering.
Okay, in the blue, and then we'll come to you.
I just wanted to say to that point, and about the film that we, thank you. I just wanted to say to that point and to the film that we started the session with, that transformational change, has to start with people, as I think has been said today, and Arthur, as you mentioned, proximity is so important. And while I think that technology is a solution for scaling change and awesome, in order to put the policies in place that can allow a technological scalable solution, you have to get the legislation passed. And one of the virtues of the events that they have been doing in Georgia, and also I know did a lot in Illinois with expungement and record sealing, is that it brings people together, and it lets somebody in a church help, or a temple, in the case of the temple in Atlanta, to help folks who need to have their records sealed. And just that very process is a way of, you may be only helping 200, 300, 400 people on a day, but what you're also doing is touching, many other people who might be on the other side of the political aisle, and involving them in the process and showing them the potential and helping them feel in their gut the reason why. And so I think that there's an advantage to that a technological solution doesn't necessarily get at. And is a solution for down the road, but in the near term, we have to change the policies, and we have to have people voting for those policies, and they have to understand why.
Can I offer one? Technology is not the solution, but it is part of the solution. Technology, policy, and process. What we have seen happen is policy that cannot be implemented, and we've made promises to constituents that are not delivered, and that is on us. That is on us. And so we often hear, wait for the technology to get to everyone. We can do that today. And so we don't have to wait for a fancy vendor to help government. Government can do it today if we tell them to. That's the policy. But we have to think about policy as informed by process, as informed by what infrastructure already exists, as informed by the user need, to make sure we're actually solving the right problem, or if we're looking for a solution in search of a problem, right? And so it is, often, and I don't come from the tech world, I sit in Code for America, I actually come as a legal aid lawyer and having worked in policy and political advocacy. And so what we find in policy advocacy in the world is there's this thing that happens where the solution comes later. We are writing policy. Policy, by definition, is a solution to a social problem that we've identified as needed. So how do we, so much is at stake in this. And what we've seen in testing in small ways is that government can do it today. Illinois can do automatic conviction relief. They can. It's complicated. It's a decentralized court system. So is California, but it can definitely do it. And so how do we get there? And I think we need to bring together the threads of process, of policy, of technology, of people, of user need to have this conversation.
Go ahead.
Yes. So Arthur, I'm glad you had made mention in regards to, just sort of changing the narrative on how we begin to look at formerly incarcerated individuals. I often thought that the narrative has been that individuals with misdemeanors are redeemable, and individuals with felons are the boogeyman, right? And so I want to walk out of here without question, with an action, right? And so in shifting that narrative, what are some examples can you give around how can we actually begin to shift that narrative on how people look at formerly incarcerated. I have some ideas myself once you said it, but also just giving some more, so sort of like marching orders as well. You know what I mean? Thanks.
So one of the things that I do is I take conservatives, some just crazy far right people, and I take them to reentry programs in prisons around the country. I took the VP at Heritage to a prison, and and at the end, listen, the guy he didn't walk out there and be like, oh my God, everything's changed. But you know what he did say to me? He's like, I'm going to stop referring to people as inmates and prisoners. I'm going to change my language because I never thought of it that way. Listen, Heritage is still really far right. All right, they're not on board with the way that I see the world. So that is little tiny things that we can do. Is individuals that have criminal history records, being around them and seeing that they're not the boogeyman. I totally agree with you. I hate the idea that if you have a felony in your record, first of all, people, if in the federal system, a felony is nothing. A pinky worth of marijuana can be a felony in the federal system, depending on what your background is. So that isn't even persuasive to me at all. So that's one thing that we're trying to do. I think that if you have a voice, use it. I've written like 400 op-eds, and the vast majority have been just consistently beating this drum. I'm a prosecutor. I got a Purple Heart from Iraq. I was a cop. Nobody's going to call me a hippie. So I am persistently kind of hitting the drum of you can be conservative, you can be a libertarian, and still think that every American is entitled to the American dream, regardless. If you serve a prison sentence, when you're done with your prison sentence, welcome back, brother. Welcome back. And so I don't know. I can't give you marching orders. I need to know you more. But I think you can give me marching orders. You can tell me what's persuasive, because I need to know what's persuasive across the spectrum.
Yeah, just on narrative shift in general. It's huge. Oh my God, huge thing to do. But language, like you said, and I think some people are like, oh, you're trying to be too politically correct. But no, language matters, and how you talk about things matters. I think the communicator. So especially in employment spheres, like we've found that highlighting an employer that has already kind of turned a corner on how they are hiring and viewing people, have them talk to other employers.
And had success.
Yeah, and had success, exactly. The messenger matters a lot of times. And then, just narrative shift comes down to changing hearts and minds. So it's kind of a bit of a catch-22, but people need to change hearts and minds with stories. And the reason I say it's a catch-22 is because I feel like it's unfair to put that burden on people who've had experiences to have to keep sharing them with everyone, and also to keep lifting up parts of their past that they might rather just let go. But hearts and minds, personal stories are so important.
Okay, so we're right at time, so I'm going to actually close out the panel, but I want to thank the speakers, not only for their insights and thoughts, but also for their work. This is really hard work, and so thank you for what you're doing, and thank you to people in the audience who are also doing this work. It's not magic that we've moved this far in the field. This is a combination of a lot of people doing a lot of great work. So thank you. This is really a really informative conversation.